In 1915, Leo Frank had been in prison for over 2 years, yet he had never felt closer to his wife Lucille.
My dear honey, it has indeed been an ordeal for us both. But in time, both of us will be happy.
My own, I am so lonesome. Of course, the world as a whole knows you are guiltless, but you must be vindicated.
You certainly looked fine Saturday and Sunday. It is a joy to have so good-looking a wife as you are.
Just a line to tell you good night.
My name is William Smith. As one of the prosecution team, I felt responsible for Leo Frank's fate. But the more I reviewed the case, the more I began to question whether I had made a terrible mistake. Newt Lee, night watchman over at the National Pencil Company, was making his regular rounds in the factory basement at about 3 a.m. when he made a grisly discovery. All Newt could remember afterwards was the cord that strangled her and her underclothes, pulled down and bloodied. Though it was the dead of night, Newt telephoned his factory superintendent, Mr. Leo Frank. If Leo Frank had only answered the phone, the course of his life might have been different. Instead, Newt called the police.
Yes, sir. There's been a girl killed up here. 37 Forsyth Street. Yes, sir. The National Pencil Factory. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Within minutes, the police were on their way. In April 1913, Atlanta was giddy with excitement. The New York Metropolitan Opera had just come to town, a clear symbol of how far Atlanta had risen from the ashes of the Civil War. A small town of 7,000 had become a booming city of nearly 180,000, the industrial gateway to what we called the New South.
What really made it grow was that it became a magnet for a lot of businessmen who see the city that's now at the center of this developing South as the place to make it.
The Selig family, like other prominent Jews, prospered as Atlanta grew. 3 years earlier, when she was 20, Lucille Selig had met and married Leo Frank, a recent arrival from New York. Raised in a German Jewish family in Brooklyn, Leo was an engineer by training who had graduated from Cornell. And after learning the business in Europe, he'd come to Atlanta to run the pencil factory, part owned by his Uncle Moses. High-strung by nature, Leo threw himself into his work, obsessing over every detail. So instead of joining Lucille for the opera, Leo was where he always was on Saturdays, at least according to his later testimony.
Mr. Frank?
What can I do for you, miss?
I've come to collect my pay, sir.
What's the employee number?
Number 186.
In the early afternoon, Mary was going to the Confederate Memorial Parade, and she was very excited about it. It was a big event in Atlanta at that time, and on her way there, she went to stop at the pencil factory to pick up her paycheck of $1.20.
Mary Fagan was 13 years old. She was typical of young girls coming from the farm to join Atlanta's growing workforce.
She was very vivacious and bubbly and had a wonderful personality.
Mr. Frank? Has the medal arrived yet?
Mary Fagan worked in the department of the factory where erasers were inserted into the metal tips of pencils, and there had been very little work for her that week because a metal shipment was late in coming.
Not yet, I don't think.
She then walked out of his office. He heard her steps receding away, and he never thought of her again until the next morning.
The next morning, Sunday, police were crawling all over the factory basement. They were mesmerized and sickened by the brutality of the crime. But they were puzzled too.
Next to the body were two notes that were handwritten, and they were handwritten as if while somebody was molesting Mary Fagan, she was writing these notes.
He said he would love me laid down, but that long, tall, black nigger did boy hisself.
Ma'am, that nigger hired down here did this. Long, slim, tall nigger.
And Newt Lee said, "Boss, that's me." Lee's response was to the line, "black Negro." Lee was dark complected.
One of the notes also made the comment that the night witch was going to get her. That was a big phrase because everybody thought they were talking about Newt Lee, who was a night watchman. So those notes cast tremendous suspicion on Newt Lee.
After arresting Newt Lee, Detective John Black and his sidekick Boots Rogers went to speak with Newt's superintendent.
Morning, Mrs. Frank. We need to speak with Mr. Frank.
What happened? Did something happen to the factory?
Frank was a terribly agitated guy
Do I have time for coffee? I really must have some coffee.
with a heightened sense of dread and anxiety. That's how he always responded.
Mr. Frank, you need to go get your clothes on.
The German Jews came early on to Atlanta, and they opened dry goods shops. They sold perfumes. They sold window glass. They were accepted. The small shop owners became large shop owners, and the first Jewish merchants, the German Jewish merchants, the Seligs, the Montags, the Riches, became prominent Atlanta citizens. They were part of the upper crust.
When I was in school, we sang Dixie, and when we did, we stood up. I was proud to be Jewish, and I was proud to be a Southerner. Now, to most Jews, especially those raised in the North, that seems like a oxymoron. But it wasn't. Not to me.
As the lady told me, oh, that Dr. Marks, what a fine Christian gentleman he is. They wasn't talking that he wasn't Jewish, because they knew he was Jewish. They knew the temple was Jewish, but he lived a good life according to the same type of things that they believed in.
Wearing a yarmulke, a skull cap, too Jewish. Get rid of that. Bar mitzvahs, too Jewish. Hebrew, using Hebrew in the service, too Jewish. He was Dr. Marks. He was never Rabbi Marks.
But by the turn of the century, Atlanta's Jews feared a new wave of immigrants from Eastern Europe were giving their Christian neighbors a bad impression.
The women wore kerchiefs, they kept kosher, they were doing strange things on holidays like swinging chickens around by their feet. The German Jews found this to be, this is from the ghetto already. You know, what you're bringing this to Atlanta? Why, you know, this is what you should have left behind in Poland, in Ukraine, in Russia. Why are you bringing that here, where we're so much like the Episcopalians? By the time Leo Frank arrived, the position of the German Jews had become a little more precarious.
Detective Black is offended as a man by Leo Frank. Frank's extreme anxiety, his demeanor. Leo Frank seemed a foreign being. He seemed an alien.
You know a girl named Mary Fagan?
No, I don't know any girl named Mary Fagan. I know very few of the employees.
She's been found dead in the factory.
There was some dispute about whether Frank ever looked at the body, but he didn't pretend to not recognize her.
She came to see me on Saturday to pick up her pay. I don't know her name, but I recognize her dress. I can tell you for sure if I check the cash box.
After the mortuary, the police took Leo Frank to the factory to learn what they could about Newt Lee's activities the night before.
They first go to Leo Frank's office, which is on the second floor. Leo Frank goes to his safe, removes a ledger where he keeps the names of all the payroll.
Yes, Mary Fagan worked here. She came in yesterday to pick up her pay. My stenographer left at about 12 o'clock. A few minutes after she left, the office boy left. Then Mary came in to get her money and left. Very well. Let's continue.
Can you confirm the time he made his rounds?
Newt Lee was required to punch a clock on his rounds every half hour.
Everything seems to be in order.
If Newt had made his rounds punctually, he wouldn't have had time to commit the murder.
That was an important piece of information because that told the police that, you know, maybe Newt Lee didn't have anything to do with this. Newt Lee had just had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was doing his job and doing it as he was expected to do it.
But the police failed to take the punch card as evidence.
Interesting place. I do not think anyone would have described the Atlanta police force as highly skilled or highly professional in 1913.
The niceties of preserving and protecting a crime scene that we observe today and that have become a staple of television shows with yellow tape, none of that applied.
Until now, the police had used a ladder to get to Mary's body in the basement. But Frank took the detectives down in the elevator.
And when the elevator car hit the bottom, this pungent aroma enveloped these men. Someone had defecated in the elevator shaft. And here they were already heading to a site of a murder, and it was perfumed with this awful smell.
Our local newsmen sensed a good story developing. Until recently, Atlanta was known as a rather sleepy newspaper town.
The Journal and the Constitution were both established Atlanta conservative newspapers. They'd been there a long time.
That was before William Randolph Hearst came to town and bought the Georgian.
The Georgian was a sensational newspaper. He brought people down from New York, and they gave it an energy and a kind of a tabloid sensibility. This gave him a terrific opportunity to steal a march on the two established papers.
Hearst sent down his best reporters from all over the country. They saw that this was a big case, and they were going to milk it.
They had a photograph of Mary Fagan's corpse. The head was indeed Mary Fagan's, but it had been attached to a living child's body, almost like it had been photoshopped to increase the grotesqueness of the image.
All bets were off in terms of what kind of sensationalism would be tolerated, because if you're going to capture the attention of the public away from Hearst, you're going to have to play his game.
So everything was enhanced, tuned, peaked to make kind of an ongoing serial that you would stay tuned to see what the latest bizarre, frightening development is.
The police had sweated Newt Lee in repeated interrogations, even firing a gun next to his head. But Newt did not break. They were becoming convinced of his innocence. That's when Leo Frank walked into police headquarters to say he'd reviewed Newt's punch card and found several punches missing.
And Frank was suggesting that during those interludes, Newt Lee might have been involved in the murder, might have been moving the body. It was suspicious. To the police, it was suspicious for a different reason. The police felt that Frank might have altered the time slip to make them take the conventional view of the case that the black man found the body, ergo the black man killed the girl.
I paid her and she went out of the office. It was impossible to see what direction she went in when she left. I didn't.
The more Leo Frank seemed to implicate Newt Lee, the more the police began to suspect Frank himself. The detective's theory had Leo Frank committing the murder and then dictating the notes to Newt Lee in order to throw suspicion on a black man. The next morning, they arrested Leo Frank. The Georgian declared the case solved.
I think that once he was arrested, that it made sense to the Fagan family. They really believed that he was guilty.
Mary was buried in her hometown of Marietta, 20 miles outside of Atlanta. The pastor spoke for the whole town in asking God for vengeance. Meanwhile, Leo Frank was held in the county jail, what we all called the Tower. But he was not the only one being held for the murder. Jim Conley, the factory sweeper, had been arrested after he was found acting suspiciously.
He was arrested by the police several days after the murder when he was found in the pencil factory washing red stains from a shirt. They may have been blood, they may have been rust. No one knows because the shirt was not chemically examined by the police, and Conley was just put in jail on suspicion.
Conley was considered just an illiterate black man and questioned only as an afterthought.
I visited the butt-end saloon and I went on back to the pool table and I saw 3 colored men shooting dice, and I joined them.
In a sense, Jim Conley was every man, every black man, in that he had spent his life having to learn how to work around white people. The Southern stereotypes about the ignorant, bumbling black man played into his strengths. He was not dumb. He was not slow mentally at all. He was very smart.
I swear for God, no, I don't know a thing.
What, did you know how to write?
No, sir. I don't. I never could.
Will you swear that?
I sure will.
They asked him about the notes. He said, I can't read and write. That happened to come up in a conversation between the police and Frank said, of course he can write. I know he can write. He used to borrow money from me and sign promissory notes. So Conley had not been completely honest with the police.
Do you know the penalty for perjury?
What's perjury?
Swearing a lie.
But I ain't gonna swear no lie.
You will if you swear you can't write. Recognize the signature, Jim?
Why, folks, I'm a liar.
Then the police proceeded to dictate bits of the murder notes. And he wrote them down, making some of the same spelling errors in the notes. The interrogation of Jim Conley went on over a several-week period. It was good cop, bad cop.
But I didn't do it. For God, I didn't.
You'll be hung just as sure as you're a foot high in black.
But I ain't guilty. I don't know a thing about them notes or that killing. Honest, white folks.
Boy, there ain't a jury in the world, not even a nigger jury, think you didn't kill this girl. They'd hang you or they'd lynch you. Likely lynching.
There is a tradition of lynch law in which the people felt perfectly free to act on their own.
Take them out and kill them, be it by hanging, burning, a combination of the two, shooting, and all those occurred. Sexual mutilation, gouging out of eyes, cutting off of ears.
The constant cry was, black men are lynched because they're raping our wives and daughters. In fact, the great majority had nothing to do with even accusations of rape.
There are hundreds of stories on which men have been lynched or nearly lynched because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Jim Conley then changed his story.
Mr. Frank asked me to come into his office. He asked me could I write. I told him yes, I could write a little bit.
Conley came forth with a new statement in which he said that Leo Frank dictated the contents of the murder notes found by Mary Fagan's body, and that Conley put them in his own writing. According to Conley, Frank said, "I wanted to be with her, but she resisted, and I'm afraid I hurt her."
When he whistled for me, I went upstairs. He asked me if I wanted to make some money right quick, and I told him, yes, sir. He told me that he had picked up a girl back there and that he had let her fall and that she had hit her head against something. Well, I hollered back to him and told him that the girl was dead. He told me to pick her up, put her on the elevator.
Conley produced 4 affidavits. According to the 4th affidavit, Conley, at Leo Frank's instruction and with Leo Frank's assistance, takes the body in the elevator to the basement, where several hours later Newtley would discover it.
The detectives were completely satisfied that he couldn't have come up with this story out of his imagination, this ignorant darky, who must now finally be telling the truth after skillful interrogation by these Atlanta policemen.
That's where I come in. Though the state was going after Leo Frank, I figured Jim could use a lawyer.
William Smith's a very unusual guy for that time. He represented a lot of black clients, and he did so because he actually had a real belief in equal justice for blacks.
I believe that Frank was the guilty man and Jim Conley, at most, an accessory. But I feared that with unlimited funds, Frank's defense might find a way to blame it on Jim. So I decided to forego my fee and represent Conley, urging him to cooperate with the prosecutor and become the state's star witness against Frank. Now, Jim, when I ask you a question, you look at me. And when you speak to the jury, you look at them, right in the eye.
Yes, sir.
He feared Jim Conley was going to be railroaded. And week after week, he worked with Conley.
Jim, what time did you do this or that?
Telling him how to look at the jurors, how to pronounce certain words, really polishing Conley as a performer.
Now, Frank's attorney, he'll come after you hard. Leo Frank's trial began on a hot July day in 1913. The courtroom was packed with spectators and reporters. Frank had the finest defense money could buy. He was flanked by his mother, Ray, and his wife, Lucille.
Be seated. Solicitor Dorsey, call your case.
Your Honor, we call the People versus Leo M. Frank.
After a string of embarrassing losses, Hugh Dorsey, our Solicitor General, was putting his career on the line with this trial.
This was fourth quarter, 2 minutes to go in his career, and he needed to put some points on the board.
When was the last time you saw Mary Fagan alive?
On the morning of April 26th at my home.
Fanny Coleman, Mary Fagan's mother, testified first.
How old was Mary Fagan?
She was nearly 14 years old.
Mrs. Coleman. Are these the clothes that she was wearing?
All of a sudden, you realized what was at stake. The pain and the grief and the loss. It was extremely effective theater.
Yes, I went to Mr. Frank's house with Boots Rogers.
Did he seem nervous?
Yes. He asked very rapid questions in regards to what happened. He wanted to know if something happened at the factory and if the night watchman had reported it. And the last question he asked before I had a chance to answer the first.
Oh.
Frank's demeanor was central to Dorsey's case.
When you appeared at the factory, what, in general, did you do?
Newt Lee was now a witness for the prosecution.
Howdy, Mr. Frank.
He also testified that Frank was acting strangely that Saturday.
He came to the door rubbing his hands and said, Newt, I'm sorry I called you in so soon. You could have been at home sleeping.
Dorsey began to build a very credible belief in the jury's mind that circumstantial evidence led only to one possible killer, and it was Leo Frank.
They started lining up at 6:30 a.m. to get a seat the day Conley testified. By 9, the line stretched a quarter mile to the state capitol. We all knew what this trial would come down to. Jim's word against that of Leo Frank. After weeks of preparing him, I was keen to see how well Jim would do on the witness stand.
Bring in Jim Conley.
Smith had bought Conley a new suit of clothes, so he looked sharp, an altogether different figure than the dusty, skulking man who'd been arrested a couple months before.
Now, do you know Leo Frank?
Yes, I know him. There he is. Mr. Frank told me he wanted me to come to the pencil factory on Saturday morning at 8:30.
Now, had you ever been down there before on Saturdays?
Yes, sir. Several times.
How often?
Objection, Your Honor. Immaterial.
Sustained.
What conversation did you have?
He said he wanted me to watch for him like I had done on other Saturdays.
And what had you been doing on other Saturdays?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
I would watch for him while he was upstairs in the office talking to young ladies.
And how often had you done that?
Several times.
Now, when you got to the factory, what happened?
Mr. Frank told me that a young lady be coming up here pretty soon, and we want to chat a while. Then the lady came in, went upstairs, and I heard her feet going towards the front of the office. Well, then I dozed off and fell asleep.
Jim mentioned several details the defense might have pursued, but didn't.
Jim Conley casually admitted that he defecated in the factory elevator shaft.
Then she came in and went upstairs.
It seemed a throwaway detail, but later on would be terribly telling.
Well, then what happened?
I heard Mr. Frank whistle, and I went and unlocked the door just like he said. Went upstairs, and Mr. Frank was standing at the head of the stairs, and he was shivering. He was rubbing his hands together and acting funny.
Now, did you look at his eyes?
Yes, sir.
How did they look?
His eyes was large. It was funny and wild.
Although he may have been black, he was on the same level, though, I should say, as far as the Southerners, in that Leo Frank was a foreigner. Leo Frank was a Yankee. Leo Frank was an industrialist. Leo Frank was a Jew.
I had seen Mr. Frank.
So Jim Conley was basically the local hometown man.
Now, did Frank say anything to you?
He says, I want to be with the little girl, and she refused me, and I struck her. Must have struck her too hard. Yeah. He says, of course, I ain't built like other men.
Hugh Dorsey just wanted Conley to tell the story. But Conley did something else.
I seen Mr. Frank in the office 2-3 times before, and a young lady was in the office. And she is sitting down in a chair, and she had her clothes up to here. Mr. Frank was down on his knees, and she had her hands on Mr. Frank.
Conley said that Leo Frank had a penchant for taking sexual advantage of the young girls who worked at the factory.
I was willing to do anything for Mr. Frank, him being a white man and being my superintendent. So I sat down at the table, and he dictated the notes to me. And then he said, here's $200. And he said, you just keep your mouth shut. Why should I hang? I have wealthy people back in Brooklyn.
Jim Conley was mesmerizing. You could not have followed that in the courtroom and even doubted that what he was saying made a great deal of sense.
This time we would request a recess.
Frank's lead attorney was Luther Rosser.
Luther Rosser was the bludgeon that Atlanta's wealthy used to sweep inconveniences out of their way. He was a big, bombastic guy, so obstinate that he wouldn't wear a necktie when he would argue cases. And it was more than just a stylistic flourish. He didn't feel he had to wear a tie because he was Luther Rosser.
Jim, you and I understand each other thoroughly, don't we?
Rosser set out to expose the contradictions in Jim's statements to the police.
But Jim, you told Black that you woke up at 9:30 in the morning of the 26th, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
That wasn't so, was it?
No, sir.
You lied, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
In fact, you lied all the way around.
I told some stories.
Jim, all these lies... Sorry, let's not call them lies. We'll call them stories. All these stories, did you notice them before you went to jail or afterwards?
I just remember.
I just remember. Well, Jim, to whom did you make your first change in your confession?
I just remember.
I just remember. You disremember a whole lot, don't you?
The assumption was that Conley was, quote, a dumb nigger. And that if the two white men, smart white men, can't break his story, then he must be telling the truth.
There was a spontaneous hoorah. And at that moment, the defense realized Atlanta's sentiments had turned violently against Leo Frank.
Anything to anybody. All right, now, boys, I'm going to be asking all the questions here. Jim, how'd you like it?
I liked it fine.
The Atlanta Georgian dubbed him the Ebony Chevalier of Crime, Darktown's hero. He was the most famous black man in Atlanta.
Three weeks later, with the trial becoming the longest in Georgia history, Leo Frank finally spoke in his own defense.
I had charge of the factory, looking after the operations and seeing that our product was turned out in quality equal to the standards set by our competitors. I looked after the purchase of raw materials which are used in the manufacture.
To avoid being cross-examined, the defense had Frank give an unsworn statement. At first, he seemed only to be hurting his own cause.
The work I now have before me is the most important. It is very important that the prices be correct, that the amount of goods shipped agrees with the
He
amount
went
of
into the minutia of the accounting practices, and it was mind-numbing.
I may say as the child of my own brain, because I got it up. The first one that ever was made, I made out. Investments, values...
It went on and on and on. and said very, very little about the murder of Mary Fagan. If Freud had been in the room while Leo Frank was testifying, he would have diagnosed him as a hysteric who was burying something and was avoiding the real issue at hand.
After nearly 3 hours of this,
Now, gentlemen,
Leo turned to the real matter at hand.
I've heard a great deal about how nervous I was that morning. Gentlemen, I was nervous. I was completely unstrung. To see that little girl on the dawn of womanhood, so cruelly murdered, it was a scene that would have melted a stone. Is it any wonder I was nervous? The statement of the Negro Conley is a tissue of lies from first to last. Conley's statement as to his helping me dispose of the body, or that I had anything to do with her or to do with him on that day, is a monstrous lie. And the few occasions he claims to have seen me in indecent positions with women is a lie so vile, I have no language with which to fitly denounce it. I have told you the truth, the whole truth.
But the last word would go to Solicitor Hugh Dorsey.
Your Honor, the state calls Becca Watson.
And Dorsey called one flower of Southern womanhood after another to testify that Leo Frank had a bad character.
Becca, thank you for coming. You recognize Mr. Frank?
Some of the girls testified that he would leer into the girls' bathroom. There was one girl who testified that Leo touched her breast. So there was a lot of innuendo that he was very flirtatious with the young girls.
Little Mary Fagan was essentially a child laborer, and she was in the workforce to help her family.
It was a hard life. The hours were extremely long. They worked very, very hard for a very little bit of money. But it also meant for many of them an opportunity to have a sense of independence.
What we now call sexism or sexual harassment, those words didn't exist in Mary Fagan's time. Over and over again, one of the prime complaints of women and children in the workforce is they're being preyed upon by men.
Until closing arguments, that was really the last thing the jury heard. You know, a parade of young girls, each of whom was a stand-in for Mary Fagan, saying this man we worked for had a bad character.
Frank's defense lawyers both gave closing arguments.
Mr. Arnold?
Reuben Arnold said out loud what Atlanta's Jews had all been thinking.
I tell everybody, all within the hearing of my voice, that if Frank hadn't been a Jew, he never would have been prosecuted. So I'm asking my kind of people, give this man fair play.
Gentlemen, take a look at this spectacle, if you can.
Luther Rosser invoked prejudice too, though in a different way.
Conley is a plain, beastly, drunken, filthy, lying nigger with a spreading nose through which tons of cocaine has been sniffed. But you were not allowed to see him as he is. They cut his hair, shaved him. They gave him a bath. They even took the rags off his back, and he came in here looking like a slicked onion. You know, you take an actor, let him memorize his lines, and then you wake him up in the middle of the night, he can pick right up in his speech. But if you ask him something else, he's lost. And that's what Conley was. Gentlemen, you can look at the record of his testimony and see page after page after page where he said, "I disremember." Those words stand as a badge and a sign of perjury. And they brand Conley for what he is. A trained Barrett.
Prejudice and perjury. Gentlemen, do you think that I or that these detectives are actuated by prejudice? I mean, would we, as sworn officers of the law, have sought to hang Leo Frank on account of his race and religion and passed up Jim Conley, a Negro? Prejudice. It is the defense which injected the issue of religious bias into these proceedings. Now, not one word emanated from this side. We didn't feel it. We would despise ourselves if we had. Now, this great people rises to heights sublime, but they can sink to the depths of degradation too, and they are amenable to the same laws as you or I and the black race.
Dorsey focused on the grammar in the murder notes. He argued the mind that produced the notes belonged to the murderer, and the word "did" is not one that Jim Conley would have used unless Frank had dictated it.
Leo M. Frank felt compelled to write these letters, which he thought would exculpate him, but which instead incriminate and damn him. Did and done. It's a difference between education and ignorance. Old Jim Conley, every time he opens his mouth, he says, "I done." This man had been expecting for some time to cause this little girl to yield to his blandishments and deflower her. She wouldn't yield, so you struck her and you ravished her. You gagged her. And to save your reputation, which you had with the members of Dr. Marx's church and your kinfolk up in Brooklyn, you fixed that little girl. Because dead people tell no tales.
There was a Catholic church within sound of the courtroom, and Dorsey waited, padding, filibustering, tacking back and forth.
Your Honor, there can be but one verdict, and that is we, the jury, find the defendant, Leo M. Frank, guilty.
And then he said guilty as the first bell of that Catholic church chimed.
Guilty!
And he repeated the word 12 times between each chime.
Guilty! 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 Guilty!
With the city on edge while the jury was deliberating, Judge Leonard Roan brought in the lawyers.
I think we all know the outcome. Even if he were found innocent, the defendant would be lynched. Now, I would urge you all to agree not to have the defendant present in the courtroom when the jury delivers the verdict.
The prosecution and defense both agreed. The jury was back within a few hours.
Gentlemen, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant guilty.
The news went out. Cheers went up. People were standing in skyscrapers around the courtroom, waving handkerchiefs, huzzahing.
There were cheers all over Atlanta. Bells were ringing.
Hugh Dorsey was swept off his feet and carried bodily across the street like a victorious coach following an NCAA championship. It was pandemonium.
Leo Frank was a half-mile away in his cell in the tower with Lucille and Dr. Marks when news of the verdict came. Leo's death sentence would ignite a form of hatred not seen before in the United States.
It was everyone's worst nightmare. The hope and the dream of America and of Atlanta was that won't happen here.
No one in the Jewish community in Atlanta publicly commented about Frank's innocence or guilt, or about the nature of the trial, even though the Jewish community was incensed.
Dr. Marks embarked on a mission to rally support from Jews outside of Georgia.
He went up north, and he was able to obtain the services of Mr. Adolph Ox.
Adolph Ox was the most famous and respected publisher in America, and the New York Times is the most famous and respected newspaper in America. What he saw in the Leo Frank case was a miscarriage of justice, something that could not stand if it was exposed to the light of day.
Other prominent Jews argued that to publicly cry anti-Semitism would backfire and play right into the hands of anti-Semites. They thought it wiser to let Frank's case quietly work its way through the appeals process.
Anti-Semitism, pure and simple, is the sole rationale for the zeal with which the police pursued Frank and the hostility which infiltrated this courtroom.
Those who crowded around the courthouse were screaming with delight.
The defense argued to Judge Roan that Frank had not received a fair trial because of the influence of the mob outside.
And there will come a time, Your Honor, when people will begin to wonder how such things could have taken place as occurred in the trial of this man.
I'm not thoroughly convinced that Frank is guilty or innocent. But I don't have to be convinced. The jury was convinced. No room to doubt that. Gentlemen, I feel it's my duty to order that the motion for a new trial be overruled.
Meanwhile, the New York Times intensified its coverage of the Frank case.
This was the first crusade that Adolph Ox had ever embraced. The Times pulled out all the stops. They hired investigators to go back to re-examine all the evidence. They had reenactments.
Adolph Ox commissioned a report that concluded that after Mary got her pay, Conley jumped and robbed her. Then he pushed her down the ladder to the basement, where he assaulted and killed her. Though Ox chose not to publish the report or its photos, He was convinced they represented the truth.
What Adolph Fox naively did not understand was that the resentment of the New York Times would be perceived as gross invasion on the part of outsiders, and especially Yankee Jewish outsiders.
The resentment was voiced by Tom Watson, a populist who had twice run for president. Now a celebrated defense attorney and publisher, Watson used his paper, the Jeffersonian, to rebut the New York Times.
Tom Watson was my great-grandfather. When Watson initially talks about the case, it is very clearly in Watson's mind a populist struggle. It is abuse of a working-class girl by a manager who is supported by money.
I think Tom Watson reacted in the way that many white Southerners did. You may welcome guests into your house, you may welcome guests into your community in a very warm, hospitable way. That Southern hospitality is very real. But the moment they begin questioning you, challenging you, it's a challenge to your honor.
He is reading the various press reports and is angered. Watson is also pointing out the fact that many of the newspapers are owned by Jews. Watson starts fleshing out the case, showing his readers the facts of the case, and presenting the evidence to them.
Anybody who thinks that Watson's newspaper simply laid out the evidence needs to go and read it. It's filled with a kind of invective and overt anti-Semitism.
Watson did not shy from referring to Frank as a Jew pervert, lascivious Jew. More often than not, Watson referred to him as the filthy sodomite.
By now, Leo had called his 6-by-8-foot cell home for nearly 2 years. His case had been reviewed and denied 13 times. His last hope lay with the U.S. Supreme Court.
I don't think the family ever wavered in their feelings that he was definitely innocent, and they never wavered with support to Leo. I think that they always thought Leo would ultimately be exonerated.
That my vindication will eventually come. I feel certain. Whether I will live to see it, I cannot tell.
Leo Frank lost by a 7-2 decision in the United States Supreme Court. The two who dissented made an eloquent statement. Oliver Wendell Holmes argued if you had to remove the defendant from the courthouse when the jury delivered its verdict, that was prima facie evidence that the trial had taken place in a hostile environment.
Leo Frank's execution was set for 2 months later. Jim Conley was serving 10 months for being an accomplice to the murder. But as I reread the trial transcript, I began to question Conley's true role in writing the murder notes.
Dorsey had argued that Conley could not have composed the murder notes because the murder notes correctly used the verb did.
Did and done. It's the difference between education and ignorance. Old Jim Conley, every time he opened his mouth, he says, "I done."
Jim said, "I did," 50 times at the trial.
things just were not adding up. And that led my granddad to want to do some deeper investigation and look into this a little stronger here.
My wife Mary Lou and I sat down in the kitchen to look carefully at Jim Conley's writings, all of them we could find, and compare them to the murder notes.
Man, that Negro down here did this.
They were taking the different words from the scribbled notes.
That, T-H-A-T.
And then my grandmother and grandfather had the idea, let's put it up a clothesline, and we'll take these different words and we'll line them up, and just to see how, wait a minute, how is this sentence constructed? It's much like, I guess, what an English teacher, and that's what my grandmother was.
He deconstructed everything that he could find that Jim Conley had ever said or written. Verb patterns, sentence construction. Jim Conley always used the word did correctly. Jim Conley was obsessively fond of 3 adjectives in front of every noun, and the murder note said that long, tall, black Negro. Conley constructed sentences like that again and again. And eventually he had what he felt was a credible linguistic fingerprint. It proved the murder notes were the product of Jim Conley's mind, that Leo Frank couldn't have had a thing to do with the notes.
My grandfather went through a lot of agony trying to decide, what do I do? And as time went on, his conscience said, do the right thing. You can't let an innocent man go to jail and be sentenced to death for something he didn't do.
As lawyer for the state's star witness, when I proclaimed Frank innocent, there were bound to be repercussions.
He took an awful lot of flack for it, and in fact, his life was threatened.
When the news broke, I sent Mary Lou and the children away. I had to carry a gun. Leo Frank hoped my statement would help lead to a full pardon, but his lawyers felt commuting his sentence to life in prison was a safer bet.
Leo Frank's lawyers didn't want a pardon. Leo Frank's lawyers expressly sought commutation.
Leo, this is our only chance for success. A commutation, far from constituting an admission of guilt.
I am not asking for mercy. I am innocent and have been unjustly convicted. What I want is justice.
This could buy us the opportunity for time and for future development.
Frank said, I don't want a commutation. I want a pardon. And Leo Frank's lawyers had to argue him down and say, a full pardon is not in the cards.
Frank's fate would be in the hands of Governor John Slayton. Governor Slayton had read my report and was hearing from others as well.
Petitions came by the box full, hundreds of thousands of signatures supporting a commutation of Leo Frank's death sentence.
The governor began his own investigation, concentrating on the evidence found in the elevator shaft by the police when they first arrived.
Governor, you have got this from Conley. That morning his bowel was moved. He went into the elevator shaft, and on the basement floor did have a passage of his bowels. Now, it is in evidence this was in the morning of Saturday before Mary Fagan came into the building.
The governor focused his attention on the excrement and when it was smashed.
This is an absolutely vital point. If Jim Conley and Leo Frank used the elevator to transport Mary Fagan's body to the basement of the factory, there would have been no fresh excrement in the factory the next day when the police and Leo Frank took the elevator down.
It was looking like Conley had lied about using the elevator to move Mary's body to the basement. Together with my linguistic analysis, the governor realized that Frank could well be innocent.
I think as he went along in the investigation, I think it matured into great doubts of his guilt. And when it did, his conscience wouldn't allow an innocent man to go to the gallows.
Frank was transported from the Fulton County Tower in the dead of night by train down to the state prison, which was in Milledgeville, deep in the heart of the state. And the next day, Atlantans awakened to newspaper headlines saying that Frank's sentence had been commuted and Frank was gone, and it was over. Except it wasn't over.
It was an immediate reaction to it. I mean, just an immediate reaction. Crowds started to form. There was a mob that marched on the governor's mansion. They had to have the National Guard to protect him. They hung him in effigy. Oof, rough time. Brave guy.
Fiddlin' John Carson, the great Appalachian musician, stood outside the state capitol singing his ballad of Little Mary Fagan.
Come all you good people, wherever you may be, supposing little Mary belonged to you or me.
By this time, Mary Fagan has become a kind of folk figure.
Mother says to weeping, she weeps and mourns all day. She prays to meet her baby in a better world someday.
Criticism of the governor was led by the publisher Tom Watson.
When a man, in Watson's view, was fairly convicted, had every opportunity for appeal, had access to the best defense money could buy, was handed down a sentence of death, and that sentence was commuted.
Judge Roney passed the sentence, you bet he passed it well. Solicitor Hugh Dorsey sent Leo Frank to.
Yeah, Watson was straightforward on that. The people have a right to carry out a verdict.
In Mary Fagan's hometown of Marietta, some of our prominent citizens met quietly.
It was solicitor generals, district attorneys, judges, a former governor. I mean, the elite of the community, well-known families. You had the Brumbies, the Clays.
My great-great-uncle, Granddad's older brother, Herbert, was one of the brains behind it, but he was the Solicitor General of the Blue Ridge Circuit. He had been the youngest president of the Georgia Senate.
My wife's grandfather. She was just shocked that her grandfather had been involved in. And I told her, I said, every prominent member of the community was involved.
They decided that they would take their automobiles, and automobiles were very rare in that day, and go to Milledgeville, Georgia, where Frank was incarcerated, and end this case.
They saw themselves as an arm of the law that had been properly administered and had been thwarted by politics. And it doesn't make it right, but I suspect that was the burning passion in their heart.
Compared to his cramped cell in the tower, Leo found the state penitentiary at Milledgeville downright comfortable. For the first time, he told Lucille, he could relax a bit.
I played the new records yesterday afternoon and today. I certainly enjoyed it.
My own. I'm so lonesome. Lots of love and kisses, my sweetheart. Good night. And may God bless you.
You certainly looked fine Saturday and Sunday. It is a joy to have so good-looking a wife as you are.
I always thought he was shy. And you see his letters to his wife go from very formal to, hey, honey, and they were very warm and loving. It seemed to me that their relationship only warmed up more and more and more the more difficult it got, and they learned to really appreciate each other.
On August 16, 1915, Leo and Lucille spent the afternoon together. It would be their last.
"25 people stormed the facility.
They were armed, they were unmasked, no fear of being recognized or apprehended.
Not a shot was fired or a lock broken.
Do I have time to get dressed?
It took about 10 minutes to get the most famous prisoner in all of America out of a state prison in the heart of Georgia in the dead of night.
They drove more than 100 miles over red clay roads toward their destination, an oak grove outside of Marietta. The grove faced the home where Mary Fagan grew up.
Is there nothing you wish to say?
I think more of my wife and my mother than I do my own life.
Frank took off his ring, and he asked that the ring be delivered to his wife. And it was delivered to her.
The noose was said to have been tied by former sheriff of Cobb County. Apparently, the lynch party members acted with solemnity and respect, if you can imagine that. They marched Frank up onto the table. And a judge was there and pronounced the sentence of the court on Frank. And then people started to come. People came by the handful, by the dozens, by the hundreds.
I think the whole community went to make sure that Leo Frank was dead.
I have talked to a couple of guys that went out to view this event. It seems kind of macabre to us these days, but they're just idle spectators. There's a man here in town that's got handcuffs, supposedly. The rope was taken down and cut up into small sections and sold. One of the stories about that is that the hardware stores sold all the rope in town because entrepreneurs bought all the rope, chopped it up, and sold it for souvenirs, which I wouldn't put it past them.
There's emotions that overcome reason. Now, that generally happens with an individual from time to time. But how did it happen to such a large group of elite, educated people, judges, solicitor generals? How did that happen? Boy, I wished I had the answer to that.
The body was taken into a funeral home in Atlanta. And hard as this number is to believe, 15,000 people passed by the body.
Our new Solicitor General convened a grand jury to find the lynchers. Or so he said.
The grand jury inquest was run by Herbert Clay, who had helped plan the lynching.
There were 7 members of the lynch crowd on the grand jury. So it was like the fox guard in the hen house.
Tom Watson went a step further, urging his readers to revive an organization that had long ago disbanded.
The self-description of this lynch mob as the Knights of Mary Fagan linked them in their own minds with this illustrious tradition of the Ku Klux Klan.
After the lynching, they met outside Atlanta on Stone Mountain to consecrate a new KKK. While the original Klan was directed against blacks, the new one would also protect society against Catholics, Jews, outsiders of any kind.
I know that 3 of those 25 Knights of Mary Fagan went to Stone Mountain to form the modern KKK in her honor.
At the same time, an opposing force sprang into action.
The Frank lynching galvanized the Anti-Defamation League. The Frank lynching said to American Jews, it can happen here.
You know, whenever my dad wanted me to behave myself, he would say, you act like that and people are going to say you're a damn Jew and you're going to get hurt just like Leo Frank did. So he became, at least to me, a boogeyman.
When I was a boy during the Great Depression, I asked my mother, who is Leo M. Frank? And my mother shook a finger in my face and said, you are not to mention that case, that incident to anybody else, and I want you to forget it. After I learned the names of the persons involved, I saw why my mother had given me such a stern warning as a boy, and that was because my uncle had been one of the planners of the case, and he was involved.
I stayed in Atlanta for 2 years after the lynching, but I was no longer able to make a living, and so I moved my family to New York, where I enjoyed a successful law practice. But for 30 years, I carried a heavy burden of guilt for what I considered to be the worst mistake in my life. At 65, I moved back to Georgia with my wife to start a school for underprivileged children. It was a dream I pursued until 1949.
My grandfather was very ill in the hospital. He was suffering from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. The only way he could communicate was by scribbling little notes on a piece of hospital notepad. The Frank case was important enough that as this man was dying, that he wanted to make a final statement.
On my deathbed, I wrote that I believe in the innocence and good character of Leo M. Frank.
My stenographer left at about 12 o'clock. A few minutes after she left, the office boy left. Then Mary came in to get her money and left.